So look, your eyes don't deceive you. When you clicked on, selected the big interview, I guess what you expected to get was the big interview, and you did. It's Graham. Nice to have you back. Speaking about having somebody back, fantastic to have had Jamie Carragher back on the big interview, returning 5 years since he first appeared on our show. That day, he was, just like Gary Neville, our first ever interview on the big interview. He was in Sky. He was preparing for Monday Night Football. We sat in a little recording booth, and I enjoyed it very much indeed, but I had the distinct impression that Jamie was thinking, what is this strange format? Who is this strange guy that I normally only see across the editorial floor on Sky Television? It was good, it was enjoyable, but I think he was still getting, trying to take my measure. Well, he's done so since. We worked together in Madrid to interview Xavi Hernandez. That was great fun. And a couple of months ago, Jamie phoned saying, look, could you give me a little bit of your ideas and thoughts and information about the Wembley match, the Champions League final of 2011 when Barca beat Manchester United? I'm writing this book. So he did. He was very kind in terms of including my thoughts in the book. He sent it to me. I read it. It's very, very good. And it catches a particular fascination of mine in that now when I'm analysing games to try and write an article or analysing games using Wisecout or YouTube in order to better present on La Liga television, the rabbit hole, the warren of things that you can dive into if you're interested in retrospective analysis of matches, of themes, of moves. There's so much to discover there, including your misconceptions. Not only whether on the night in the hurly-burly you got something wrong, but also whether time has dimmed or even just taken and mangled and spat out your recollections. Jamie Carragher seized on this as a theme and put together his book, The Greatest Games, and we used that as a reason to get back in touch with him. So this episode, we'll talk about the concept of the greatest games, and it'll start with something very dear to his heart because he was at Everton against Bayern Munich in the Cup Winners' Cup when Everton went and won that tournament. And it's a perfect example of how going back to something that was for him a cherished childhood memory, he found out very different things about the rough and tumble of playing not against Everton, but against that Bayern Munich, and how misconceptions about silky, poor old Bayern Munich were booted all over the park by Everton. Not a bit of it. So our talk is about that night, or those nights, one in Bavaria, one at Goodison, when Everton went through and knocked out a classic Bayern Munich side. But it's also about the art of punditry. I'm talking about Andy Gray, Gianluca Vialli, to Jamie and Gary with Dave Clark, and originally with Ed Chamberlain on Sky. One we focus on in this episode is the way in which England defeated Germany 5-1 in Munich, and how that related to, well, what happened, and what, when Jamie went back to look at it, how that related to England's subsequent failure to use what was dubbed the Golden Generation to actually not only win a tournament, but even to come close to troubling the scorers at big tournaments. Jamie's extrapolation of what he learned from what is held out as England's greatest performance of the modern era and how that's been marketed in a way that didn't represent big chunks of the game, you'll find that interesting, whether you're English or not. He looks really closely at David Beckham, his role in the 1999 Champions League final, and little bits come out about how much more impressed Jamie was with David Beckham, the footballer, than many judges have been. How, although he liked Sven-Göran Eriksson as a person, he didn't find him a deeply impressive England coach. He'll explain why. What comes out here hugely as well is Jamie's ability to explain what it is that he finds that causes him absolute devotion to Xavi Hernandez. Jamie's a defender, a rugged defender, somebody for whom Winning was just about everything. Somebody who maybe started in midfield, but doesn't have a massive amount of correlation with the way that Xavi played the game. And yet for him, instead of choosing a Maldini or a Willie Miller or a Bobby Moore or whatever you like to say, for him, there are two players in his life that stand out. One of them is an Italian defender, I'll grant you. But the other one is Xavi Hernandez. And here Jamie brilliantly explains why. So, this is Jamie Carragher talking about his book, The Greatest Games. Listen to it, enjoy it, tell people about it. Buy The Greatest Games for people in your life who like looking back and re-understanding matches. It's a classic book. Please also check out our new YouTube channel where you will find audio of some of our brilliant old interviews and lots of video clips from the more recent guests when we discovered what technology was and how to use it. Does it have batteries, lads? Look, this is the big interview. You're probably listening to this at or around the festive period. Have a safe, happy, healthy time. Enjoy yourselves. We've all had to work double hard to get through 2020. It's been a brutal year. But for me, being able to do this work, to speak to these people and knowing that you're there listening, sharing, sending in questions, supporting us, socios, to all of you, heartfelt thanks. This is the big interview, and I'm quite pleased and proud to not only have a guest this afternoon from whom you're guaranteed intelligence and football character, but we're going back to our origins because Jamie Carragher, as I've already explained to him this afternoon, featured in one of the early interviews, and I remember him sitting across the desk from me in a sound booth in Sky, and the words were good and the debate was good, but the eyes were saying, oh, this is one weird cookie I'm talking to here. Hopefully over the years that feeling has been erased or developed, and for anyone who's able to look at this tape of the interview, this is Jamie's exceptional book called The Greatest Games. I'm not going to talk too much about explaining it because he's going to do that for himself. First of all, Jamie, you're a popular and talented man. Thank you for sharing your afternoon with us, although I suppose of a Friday afternoon, week after week, you probably get that yearning to think, I'm going to give Graham a wee phone and just talk football with him. And thankfully, it's today we can actually do that job.
No better time and place.
No better people either. Jamie, the greatest games, first of all, so that I don't have to, explain to our listeners the concept of this book. Handsomely produced and featuring, I think, 6 or 7 words from me. What was behind your idea to write this?
Well, I've always been a big reader of football books and not necessarily footballers' autobiographies, even though, of course, I've read them. But I do read certain football books. I remember a good few years ago now, I read The Italian Job by Gabriele Marcotti and Gianluca Vialli. I've read a couple of football books by Michael Cox, who's really good analyst on football, and Mr. Zonal Markin. There was one, I think it was called Brilliant Orange or something about Dutch football.
It's a sensational book, yeah.
I've always read those type of books, and I've always thought I'd like to do a book about football, but not an autobiography, because I'd done one of those about 10 years ago. And I'm certainly not a fan of people doing 2 or 3 of them, as people do. So it basically come to me because of the work I do on Monday Night Football, analysing games, and on the back of what we've been doing with our own podcast, The Greatest Games, where we ask a guest to come on, and probably similar to what you do, and then at the end we ask what the greatest game is. And it was almost, why not let's look at some great games and give them the Monday Night Football treatment and really analyse them the way the game is now, with obviously interviews with the biggest people involved, and see what we could come up with. And we're quite pleased with it.
I'm going to list the chapters. They run like this, in order. Liverpool 4, Barcelona 0, Everton 3, Bayern Munich 1, Liverpool 0, Arsenal 2. Already you can see the skipping across generations, from the most modern to some of your youngest memories. England 5-1 in Germany, England 4-1 at home at Wembley to Holland in Euro 96. Liverpool 3, Everton 2, Manchester United 2, Bayern Munich 1 in 99 in Camp Nou. Liverpool 4, Newcastle 3, Manchester City 3, QPR 2, Aguero. Barcelona 3, Manchester United 1, which is the Wembley 2011 final. And, of course, in there, the climax, the centrepiece, AC Milan 3, Liverpool 3. Before we go into one or two of the specific chapters, Jamie, one of the things that emerges most quickly is this idea about unreliable memory, unreliable narrative, the way in which football matches sometimes on the night and the day after get mistold or misseen. Of course, it leads to endless debate at the time. But legends grow, and the way that legends grow is obviously part of the way that football grabs your heart, because it isn't just the 90 minutes. You need heroes and you need villains. You need perceived flops, perceived brilliance. And I know that in starting out, and I think through it too, it was on your mind constantly, am I going to look back and find that there were more warts than beauty spots? Is that true?
Yes, I think that's always the case. And I actually spoke to Teddy Sheringham about that, because I interviewed him for the 99 chapter in the Camp Nou and England-Holland. And he said he didn't like watching games back because he never played as well as he thought he'd played, and it almost ruins the memory. And throughout the summer, we all got very nostalgic because of, obviously, COVID and lockdown, and the old games were getting played. And he said one of the few games he actually enjoyed watching back was the Euro 96 game of England-Holland, really. So it was interesting that, because I always feel as a player, we come away from games and think we've played well, and other games we think we've played poorly. It's never as good as you think, and it's never as bad as you think when you look back at a game. But I think you're right. I think the narrative around football games a lot of the time revolves around the result rather than what's happened in the 90 minutes. And it was just really looking into that, really, and trying to, maybe if I can pick up a few nuggets and a few things that are maybe, or certainly go against the grain of what the narrative is sort of years later, and maybe make people go back and watch that game and maybe change their thinking.
Was the most, I mean, you're a Liverpool man now, as you say in the book, it's well documented that you've had a change of heart and there's a before and after, but was the game where Everton eliminate Bayern Munich, having had them softened up 2 years earlier by Aberdeen, and that doesn't get enough play in the chapter, Gemma, I'm sorry to be critical at this early stage, but you do mention us, but was that the one where, because, you know, the memories that might have been dislodged in games you played in, whether that be in Munich against Germany or whether it be Istanbul, those memories you could influence, you were a participant, but a memory that might be dislodged or besmirched when you're a kid with a bobble hat, for a certain part of the journey anyway, is that the one that you were most worried about?
Well, looking back at that, not so much, and the reason I say that is because I think what the great thing in the book is that, and whether I know it maybe upsets people from that era, and when I was speaking to Peter Reid and Andy Gray on the phone about it, the way football was played then, and certainly that Everton team had a mixture of physicality, direct football with good football. So in my mind, I don't think it's ever been shaped differently. That game is about basically bulldozing that Bayern Munich back four into the net, or almost into the Gladys Street, through set pieces, long throws, direct play from the goalkeeper. And so it wasn't so much that. The thing that was different that I found in that was that that's the way that game's always been built, you know, the power of the English and, you know, direct football. But Bayern Munich's first throw in of that game's a long throw. It's just little nuggets like that you see. And this was no shrinking violet Bayern Munich team. This was Augenthaler at the back. This is Faf in goal. You know, Lerby in midfield. Some of the challenges that went on.
Flugler.
Yeah, Flugler. I mean, Andy Gray kicks him up the arse.
He lost his boot, I think, didn't he, as well?
Yeah. And but no, and also it was good watching it also because of the fact that the way this game's been painted, it was a little bit more than that, because I think those type of coaches who we think of in, you know, certainly the 80s in England, is a bit, you play the same every week, you know, the same team, the same formation. There's no, you know, now we talk about, you know, tactics and systems and different players playing and rotation. But it was interesting speaking to Andy Gray, because I noticed it in the first half, how split Everton's two strikers were, Sharp and Gray. Normally you want two strikers together, combining, and I could see that in the tape. And he said when you were playing against the sweeper then. So it was a big thing from Howard Kendall to actually isolate defenders in wide areas, leave the sweeper alone without protection. So even then...
But let's stop, Jamie. Define what you mean by a sweeper, because I know, well, I'm going to suggest that what you're saying is that they had 3 central defenders, one of whom played behind or in front of the 2 centre-halves. So you're actually talking about a sweeper in a 3 with 2 wide backs, aren't you?
Yes, that's what it was. It's not so much 3 at the back in a zonal sense. Yeah, this is, defenders following strikers all over the pitch. So if Andy Gray and Graham Sharp know they're getting man-marked, they're taking up positions so far away from each other, which basically means defenders are getting isolated and they haven't got cover, where basically the sweeper system was all about cover. 2 men-to-men markers, going as tight as possible, and you always had that spare man behind. So if you stretch them across the width of the pitch, you're going to get isolated certainly a lot more. So even just picking up little things like that shows how much thought was going into games then. And
they change at half-time, what you described, because I don't want to overemphasise this because our listeners are quick. But what you've done is you've gone back and watched the 90 minutes once or a couple of times in each of the chapters. And therefore, and if I don't want to betray too many of the secrets because I'd like people to buy this and read this, but you pre-note your conceptions, your ideas about the game before you see it again so that you can measure them up again, which I think is a really good technique. But you say that at half-time, they play slightly closer together, don't they, Graham Sharp and Andy Gray?
Yeah, so they do. So obviously that was a tactic in the first half. It's maybe not working as well as they want, the 1-0 down, and maybe it's a case of actually, let's go back to our sort of way of doing things normally in terms, the attacking the Gladys Street end. I mean, the famous half-time team talk from Howard Kendall, that's always remembered.
Where he says what? You quote him?
Yeah, sorry. He's basically, the Gladys Street will suck the ball in for you. That type of thing. So the Gladys Street for Everton is what the Kop is for Liverpool. And
get it up there and the fans will draw it right in.
That's what it was. I mean, this is Bayern Munich. But at that stage, you mentioned Aberdeen before. But I think we looked at the stats. I think Aberdeen had been knocked out of European competition 5 years in a row, or 5 years out of 6 by English teams. So Aston Villa obviously won the European Cup final. Aberdeen, Everton, I think Tottenham knocked them out along the way somewhere as well. So at that stage, English teams' record, and especially not just in Europe but against this Bayern Munich, they had real problems.
One of the things that has emerged already in having read the book and listening to you now, perception isn't always about things becoming wrong over the years. I think that stories get told about like, for example, you've established the idea that what was said about Everton Bayern Munich from that day onwards, when you knock them out and it's in the glory years of Everton, you're about to win 2 titles with a year apart, was that Everton were the long ball, hard merchants, and not enough was spoken about the fact that Bayern not only matched kick for kick, but tried to have it out with Peter Reid, and they were bashing into the back of Andy Gray's head. So they weren't angels, but is part of what you've discovered, or do you think that over the years in Britain, the media that describe football, and I don't mean modern because I'm coming on to a supplementary, have maybe not understood football as much, and they paint it as theatre. There are always good guys and bad guys. The foreigners are often either cheating and dodgy because they're going down all the time, or they're beautiful and elegant and swaying and the ball moves and they're taller than us and their chests are puffed out, and man, look at that strip. Do you feel, because that's my perception, that has tainted the way that football matches have been described on the radio and television or written about over going back to the 70s and 80s onwards?
Yeah, I agree, Graham, and I think when we get into debates even now about systems and tactics and what managers do, I think sometimes, even in this country, and I'm talking about punditry as well, and ex-players, they don't enjoy it. It doesn't get the juices flowing. It goes over the head a little bit. They don't think the game is really about that. And I think that stems going back, a long time, when the narrative was always about the result. And even when you read our press, there's no real criticism or praise for managers in how they set teams up. I don't feel in this country, even to this day, it's all about the result. And the result just covers everything or masks everything, really. And I think there's a lot more to it than that. And I just think in England, I think with journalists or maybe press, and it's just the way we are, this is the way we are as a country, I suppose, but I think when you hear about managers going abroad, they say they get a lot more questions on why did you play a back three? Why did you make that substitution? Why did you play him in this role? Why did you do this? And they almost have to explain the actual idea, the tactical setup. I got that a lot from Gary as well when he was in Valencia. That's what people would really home in on. That would never be a question for a manager here. You know, you'd never ask if Jurgen Klopp went and played 4-4-2 rather than 4-3-3. I mean, people had mentioned it after the game, but I don't think it'd be a big debate with Klopp in the press conference. Why would you do that? What the extra man in midfield? What does 4-4-2 give you against this opposition? So I think as a country, we don't get as involved in the tactical side of the game, and that's what's something that really gets me going, and certainly in the job I do, and the Monday Night Football and the punditry. Why do teams do certain things?
The listeners know, and I'm just stating for you, I'm not going to blow smoke up your arse, but you're involved in something which is changing that. And I want you to think honestly now about the football you watched growing up, which was presented as a package. Predominantly would have been whatever ITV's. I lived in Scotland, so we got different, but ITV had their version. Match of the Day is the more famous version. It was presented as highlights with almost no tactical analysis whatsoever. The highlights per se were presented as the most entertaining bits. So the other bits that might have led to them, not relevant. And for many years, when Match of the Day expanded, I'm going to call players out, you don't have to join in. In my opinion, there was very little tactical work done by the Hansen Lawrence era, in my opinion. Insufficient. I remember Luca Vialli, when he left Chelsea, saying, I'm going to go back to Italy. I'm going to work in television. He said, I'm going to do what Andy Gray is doing for Sky. This is obviously way back in the late 90s. Because in Italy, we only think about why did that goal go in and the referee was rubbish or bent or whatever. He said, I want the debate to be opened up. And he was in Italy. Luca Vialli's mission was to go back and take what Sky was doing even then, before the days of you and Chambo and Gary and you being fixtures on a Monday night with Titi Henry. I want you to contrast, never mind talking about the quality of what you're doing, really the very fact that it's a staple part of the diet, and I know that our listeners, I know that they are voracious for the same thing that gets you going. The debate, our vocabulary's changed, Jamie. You know, across football appreciators, we might get it right, we might get it wrong, but the way in which we want to talk about football, positions, ideas, strategy, I don't think that's massively changed in the media, but I think the punters have changed. You have to talk about this honestly without me trying to make you bum yourself up. Don't you recognise the change in the way in which young footballers, say over the last 20 years, have grown up compared to how you and I grew up? You were a good athlete, you were a good football player, and you bettered your football career because you wanted to reread matches, read your position. So, okay, fine. But there are kids now who have grown up over 20, 25 years, and we'll see it in their play, who've had a completely different vitamin diet of football analysis over their lifetime. Don't you agree that's fundamental?
I totally agree. I really do. I mean, a big thing I always found when I just stopped playing was my son was at the Liverpool Academy, and that was taken over by the Barcelona influence, really. Rodolfo Borrell was there, and my son would come home to me and say, I'm playing number 6, I'm playing number 8, I'm playing this, I'm playing that. And just these things started coming in. And you can imagine the reaction in this country when a young player says that and, oh, nonsense, this is this. And I just think that influence, you talk about players as well and the analysis that they get. I think the important thing, not important as so much, I used to always think it was almost like a weakness when I was a player where I couldn't identify where a player played. I used to think, well, what's his position? What does he do? But now that almost seems that it's like, that's almost like a strength now, where, you know, people do float in and out of different positions, and sometimes we see teams playing different ways with the ball, and then when without the ball, they're playing a different formation, and there's people in different areas of the pitch, and they're interchanging and moving. And I do think the understanding of younger players now, definitely in terms of what you're talking about, but I'm not sure if you just mentioned the punters, but I actually think supporters' understanding of the game now is a lot greater. And I don't know if that's just maybe down to social media, so we see it a lot more. But, you know, there's, as you said, you go on Twitter, every club has fan sites and podcasts, and everyone's talking about the game. And the information that they give, the people out there now, as a manager, you may not just get away with results. Before it was always get results. Now supporters want to know, what's your idea? What are you trying to do? They're looking at expected goals. They're looking at how much possession they've had, how often they've been in the opposition's penalty area, and actually saying, well, we're winning games, but we're being quite lucky because we're not doing X, Y, or Z. Or the flip side of that could be, we're not doing so well, but you keep the supporters on side. Because now, I think their actual knowledge of the game and knowing when things are going well, and the absolute how much football there is in terms of Sky Sports News every day, podcasts, social media, going to the game, every game at this moment because of COVID's live on TV. I just don't think there's ever been more analysis, and it actually feels like it's changed a lot since I first went into punditry. That was probably 7 or 8 years ago. It feels over the last 4 or 5 years, it's certainly with supporters now, and people on social media, it's going up and up, really, and it's difficult to keep up.
I love what you said. No, I'm not Jamie Carragher. I've not done what you've done. But I think I've lived in Spain for a reason. I've listened, I've watched, I've benefited. I've changed my vocabulary, I've changed my understanding. You blink, miss a game, miss a decision. And the people that talk to me either as socios, members of our podcast, or on Twitter, who follow Spanish football, they'll be like, I saw that. I said, you're like, I've missed a week. And they're all over me. You have to be on top of your game to keep ahead of the people you're trying to communicate to, which is healthy.
No, I totally agree in it, and it takes me back. I treat punditry like I treated my career as a footballer, where I played at Liverpool all my career because of that, because I never gave anyone an inch. It was, I'm not saying I wasn't the greatest player in the world, but no one was taking my place, and it was always, I've got to keep going. I could never almost relax until it was finished. And I'm a bit like that with punditry, and I agree with you. If you don't watch your game or you miss the big incident, you feel like you're behind the curve. It's like you're almost playing catch-up, trying to watch it, and it's moved on again, the narrative or whatever it may be. And that's the way I am with punditry. I watch all the other shows to check what they're doing. I'm across everything as much as I possibly can to know. And it doesn't mean I'm then going to be right. I can be right, I can be wrong. It's an opinion, but you can base your assumption on having really watched it and know exactly what's going on, what's getting said, read the room, what's the reaction to certain things, and then almost give your point of view. But no, I'm like that with pundit. There's new pundits coming all the time wanting to maybe take your place, or people will eventually say, we've heard enough of that. And that's why I think in my role it's very important. I want to say my role, I mean there's everyone's role in punditry, whether you've been a player or a journalist, but I'm very mindful of the fact of never saying in my day. I think you can use experiences from your time, but almost never. I always think football's the best it is now, and in 2 years it'll be better then than it is now. And the game moves on, and you look back at your own games compared to games now, it's much better, the football. And I think you've got to sort of keep up with how the game's moving forward, and not sort of say, well, we did this and we did that. It's when you see the goal kicks now. I mean, it fascinates me, goal kicks now, and that's like the detail I like to go into. But someone will lose the ball around the edge of the box, and then people say, we never did nothing like that. But these managers aren't idiots. They're all doing it. There's a reason for it. Sometimes it's not going to work, but what are they trying to get out of it? So that's what I'd be thinking. These managers are, so don't be saying, we never lost the ball around the edge of the box. Well, you're never going to lose it around the edge of the box if you kick it long, but there's a why. What's the reason? Why are we doing it? Almost get into that rather than say, this is wrong. We never did that.
Spot on. If you don't unpick it, and if you don't work at the what is the chess game end game, then you can't decide, well, actually, I see what Nagelsmann and Bielsa and Sarri and Pep are trying to do with that. And I like the idea of looking at it, but I don't fancy it actually for this squad, that player, this crowd. It's that, okay, some coaches will say, these are my principles, bollocks to you, I'm staying with the first. But if you don't try and unpick them, if you just do that, that's right, or that's fashionable, I must do that, or that's wrong, we didn't use, then you're never going to work out, well, what's it for? And I think that, what's something for? And you caused me to go back to the last time we'll talk about the game that, well, the only game that's passionate to you as a fan. That Everton game, there's a eureka moment. I can't remember from the book whether you realised it on the night as a 11-year-old kid. I can't remember, but there's a eureka moment in your analysis when you're looking at, who is it? Eder, one of the centre-halves goes off with a bleeding nose. And I'd seen this at Pataudry when Aberdeen got knocked out by Fergie's Aberdeen got knocked out by Hamburg, and we had a player off and we played on. And your point, I'll let you take up the narrative. Your point is that I think Lerby takes a free kick with Bayern still only having 10 men on the pitch. And from that moment, Everton in possession of the ball, and they do certain things, and it's just not a very mature piece of thinking. And your analysis going back there reminded me of you'd be analysing it exactly the same way today if you were on your legs with Dave Jones on Sky. Just detail that incident that I'm talking about that was so crucial to the tie.
Yeah, I mean, if we'd make a big thing of it now, if someone went off the pitch, you'd be well aware of it. I think probably even watching the football years ago, I mean, the commentator wouldn't even probably mention it. You'd almost not know that they were down to 10 men in some way, really. But I noticed that he went off. They then put a set piece in trying to slow the game down and maybe wait for the guy to come back on and help them. I think they take a free kick quickly. Before you know it, it's in Southall's hands. And Everton find themselves with long throws. Now, you're talking about one of the centre-backs. 3 at the back, 3 dominant players. Again, you take advantage of that. Really, it forces the goalkeeper to come out the goal, Faf, to try and deal with it because he knows the 2 defenders alone and the 1 man down can't deal with it. He almost ends up getting thrown into the Gladys Street, and then there's an empty net, I think, for Andy Gray. But I just think at that time it just didn't get mentioned. No one really spoke like that or went into that detail. Really, and that's what we wanted to do with games, and that was the oldest game that went back to 85 of me as a 7-year-old. So it was just those things that I thought we'd be mentioning that and making a big deal of that, really, and game management.
There's a thorny issue now. I should look because we've got social questions. Bet365, our sponsors, asked the Germany 5-1 game came after a low point for England losing 1-0 at Wembley. Did he get a man goal? Did you feel a corner had been turned that night? You were on the pitch, as you say in the book. You had a beautiful, devastating 7-minute cameo defending that 4-0 lead. I'm stealing your words, but it's one of the best phrases in the entire book. So before you answer that question, there are a couple of more, and we've got Merrin Myrtle. We're going to ask a question from Gareth Scriven, Jake Garlick, and Jake Garlick says, in terms of the 5-1 in Munich, what does Jamie think of Sven as a manager? What did the players think at the time about the tactics he used, whether they were the right ones for modern football? Does Jamie think that they underachieved or were unlucky to lose on penalties twice to a very good Brazil side? How much of a difference did injuries to key players make? There's a lot of information in that question. The sponsor's question was, after the 5-1, did you think a corner had been turned? Maybe the answers to both Jake and to 365 come in the shape of your deductions from that chapter, which is an extremely powerful chapter, and maybe when people read it, they'll find it the most surprising chapter, I think.
Yeah, I mean, looking back, obviously it was a huge euphoria, the press, and beating Germany. It's a derby game, if you like, at that type of level. And when I look back at the game, it almost was a snapshot of why we didn't do well. I mean, that was a game we should have been losing 2 or 3-1 at half time. I think when I say it gave us a snapshot of why we didn't do well, we gave the ball away so much in the first half. But don't forget, this is in the middle of a season. You're in Germany. It's certainly not baking hot. It's not in the Far East where I think that World Cup was. And you've got Scholes, you've got Gerrard, Beckham, 3 of the best passes of the ball you'd probably see. But not necessarily the 3 passes you want together in the same team, because they all make the same pass, which is always looking for that 60, 70 yard pass and diagonal ball over the top for Michael Owen. So it works a lot in this game, certainly more second half. But in the first half, the turnover in possession was the reason why we should have been 3-1 down, and almost gives you a reason why when you get to those summer tournaments, the turnover in possession was just far too much. And then you contrast that with players you know so well, Graham, of your Iniesta and Xavi's, very rarely played that pass. Very, very rarely. It was always what was the right pass for the team. It wasn't about the Hollywood ball, as we called it. As I said, these are 3 of the best technicians we've ever had and 3 great players. But that's maybe the makeup of that team and squad, whether it actually gelled together and worked together. And it was proven that it didn't really. In terms of Sven, I don't think I ever saw a team Sven picked and thought, what is that? can't believe he's picked that team. Because you do get that with managers where they do something that you just cannot quite comprehend. But he always picked the obvious team, you think the best players, so you think nothing outrageous. But did he ever sprinkle a bit of stardust in any way as a manager with what he said or how he set up or throwing something different in a big game and tactically? No. I mean, he didn't. I find it difficult to criticise managers for two reasons. One, I've never been a manager. And number two, I always think when players criticise managers, I'm not a big believer in that, because I think the manager, number one, has got another 20, 30 years experience in football. He's managing, you haven't. So when I hear a player who's 25 saying, oh, the coaching's not great, or the manager's not this, or I don't really listen too much. So I'm probably a bit nicer to managers than maybe other players are. But with Sven, I don't think there was anything he ever said to me, ever, in the time I was there, where I thought, that's interesting, or I've learned that, or that's new. Other managers I had, he'd always say something that make you think, whereas Sven, it was very, very, very basic.
I've got to offer you something, Jamie, and I'm not causing an argument, but I want to relate what you said earlier on. You talked about understanding out on the continent, managers, coaches will be asked more probing questions about their idea, about their training, about their football, about the strategy, about substitution. And you talked about Gary experiencing that at Valencia. And listen, I was at some of those press conferences, it got very heated, but they were asking, why are you here, or why are you English? Why did you do that? Now, it's the manager or the coach's job to get things right. I was speaking to Luis Enrique yesterday. He said, I'm here in a no excuses situation. He said, we're here to win. Yeah, playing well against Germany, 6-0. There's no excuses in my vocabulary. We have to win tournaments. So that's very good. So the responsibility lies there. But you've talked about not wanting to criticise a manager. And I've found that in my lifetime in British football as an institution and British football journalism. The criticism that comes from journalism is often too personal. And in football, I think there's a culture where it's too irregular for good minds like yours, like Gary, like Thierry Henry. Thierry's French, but there's a culture in Britain about if you say something that's contrary to what you've experienced or what you... there's a preference for speaking in euphemisms or maybe burying a criticism, because we're quite a warlike culture. If you criticise somebody, it's calling out, let's write it's all off. And I'm like that. But what you learn is debate like that, where you're critical at the time or now, it opens up the debate. It helps change the culture. I don't think that we're particularly healthy in the fact that you'll have footballers of knowledge and worth within a club or within an international team during our lifetime. I'm much older than you, but whereby they'll say things in private and they won't say them in public, or they won't say them to journalists, because to criticise is wrong. Whereas in other cultures, it doesn't make them better or clever, but it is different. It's worth learning from. These types of criticisms that you might have offered back then, I think, because we've interviewed Sven in this podcast, I think when he managed Mancini and their ilk, or Mihailovic or Veron, they came to him and went, manager, what's this? He talked about a big bust-up he had with a 20-year-old Clarence Seedorf who came in at Sampdoria. This is rubbish. And he went, okay. And so I worry about whether, culturally, I don't mean you, but culturally, I think we're too slow to have at it.
I think you're right. And I don't know if it was something to do with being brought up with Liverpool, and it was almost, being humble, you never get too carried away. And I always remember Pepe Reina saying to me, it wasn't so much about the manager, it was when we were having problems as a club off the pitch with American owners. And he said, because obviously it was seen as me and Steven Gerrard are the two most powerful players, if you like, and had huge influence. But in reality, we'd never be critical of anyone at the club. We were always very supportive of the club, even if it was bad. And he was saying, players in your position, this was Pepe Reina to me and Steve, he said, they'd be causing trouble. They'd be out in the press criticising this. He said, in England, everyone's so humble and everyone's so supportive of their own club. He said, this would not happen abroad, really. And that was another thing when Rafa came as a manager as well, was that he would be quite openly critical of his chief executive, of his owner, whereas we'd be like aghast, could not believe he'd said these things. I'm like, this is not the Liverpool way, this is not the way we do it here. And not necessarily England, more, I was always having the Liverpool hat on. And it was like, you don't criticise people you work with, you don't do this. But maybe, you know, what you're saying is maybe we're the ones who should be looking at ourselves a lot more and not so much be critical, but maybe analyse a little bit more, push, probe, get, you know, find more answers.
I think so, because the resources that you've become to football, you and your group, people of your quality, is now super clear. Beyond just winning, now your analysis is helping change the shape of the British game. Let's not go in depth as to the, you know, Scholes, Gerrard, Lampard, Beckham debate and why that didn't yield a trophy for England, because trophies are coming. And if you look at the way in which the younger footballers that have won the 2 World Cups and have been to European finals at age group levels, there's a different brand of footballer, with a different idea. And I think that I'm uncertain if Gareth Southgate is the man who's going to take them to a trophy for other reasons, but his culture change in general reflects somebody who's thought deeply about what went wrong previously. But describe for the listeners who don't understand, because your central point about that Bayern Munich game in Bavaria where England beat Germany 5-1 was there were things there that shouldn't be obscured by the 5 goals, the fact that Michael Owen knew he could run all over them. He played against Bayern Munich a couple of days earlier in the Super Cup, had run past 2 of the defenders and scored past their goalkeeper, and it was a beautiful night. I remember being excited by the win. There's no getting away from that. But the loss of possession, describe it as a footballer who played in tournaments or sometimes if you were the 12th, 13th man, you watched it. The feeling of a long English season, going to a tournament, playing against a rival that kept the ball, getting the ball back and giving it away, and then what that felt like. Because it just must have broken the spirit, never mind dented England's ability to play winning football.
I don't think I've ever enjoyed any tournament I've ever played in. And that goes back to being a kid. It was almost like you couldn't wait for it to be over. And I don't mean that we wanted to lose a game or get knocked out, but I mean, you couldn't enjoy the games, really. And you might laugh at this, but I played fullback in a game against Trinidad and Tobago. So not a huge, obviously, name, and not a game, or not a country who were going to dominate possession-wise, as you're maybe mentioning. But it was that stifling hot, and I was playing fullback. And I'd played centre-back all season. I played fullback, different running needed in that position. I ended up getting in the ice bath at half-time. Never mind the end of the game. I was in it at half-time. I was that hot. And when you were playing in those type of conditions, the way we wanted to play of high intensity, maybe turnovers, win the ball back, it was not enjoyable. You couldn't... And I speak to other players and they tell me the same, really, that we never actually had a game where you can actually look back and go, I played in the World Cup. Okay, we never won it. But I always think about the Champions League. You don't win the Champions League every year, but you still embrace it, you still love it, you still remember the stadiums you went to. But I played in 2 World Cups. Now, without blowing my own trumpet, it's a big achievement to play in the World Cup and to do it twice. But when I think of my career highlights, I never think of playing in a World Cup or playing for England or the stadiums we played in. I can't ever remember enjoying the game, really. Now, I don't ever like coming across as sort of making excuses because of the lack of a winter break or the way we play football, because there's English players who played in the Premier League who've won a World Cup. Look at the French lads in '98, certainly the Arsenal team that won the double as well in that position. But with England, it was just it was very difficult for me, or I found it sort of physically at the end of the season, and that was going back sort of years before, for whatever reason, that I sometimes think, do we actually put too much into our game where it's like a matter of life or death? It feels at times with sort of Liverpool, Man United, Chelsea, Arsenal. And you'd never sort of rest or think about the World Cup was coming. I mean, I'd find that unbelievable if a player said to me, oh no, I've got to get myself ready for the World Cup. I'd be like, for me, club football was always, and always is, the number one. But the flip side of that is, you look at Spain with Madrid and Barcelona and how they come together, and those games with Guardiola and Mourinho where it was almost like a war, and they found a way to some way, get together.
Dispiriting to think back like that for an Englishman. There's a link, player, to another chapter that we have to speak about. One of our socios has written in to ask you, Bet365 have written in to ask you, be honest, what was your feeling? How did you react when Ole Gunnar Solskjaer scored against Bayern Munich in 1999, and United had done it and won the treble, won a Champions League, which was Liverpool's territory. But, a secondary one from that is that when we sat down in his home by the lake up in Sweden and spoke to Sven-Göran Eriksson, he's a great storyteller, and you call him an unremarkable coach, and you make the case well in the book, which, if people don't read My Greatest Games by Jamie Carragher, they're making a mistake, or buy it as a present. Sven, you talk about as being an interesting guy and that people liked him as an individual, but an unremarkable coach. When Sven was telling us his stories, and they were remarkable stories, and this is a man who'd taken in some refugees, Afghan asylum seekers who had no money, no food, and he'd housed them at the bottom of his garden just because he's a good man. Astonishing thing. And in the middle of his interview, he started talking about, he was comparing Gianluca Vialli and particularly Roberto Mancini and just drooling over them as a coach, as an appreciator of football. And then he said, but they're not David Beckham. And he talked about David Beckham in a reverential style that from another grown-up man in football I haven't heard. You can appreciate him. People catalogued his looks, his style, his wins. People were very good at talking about his delivery of the ball. Sven-Göran Eriksson was enthralled to him. Just thought he was one of the most amazing men he'd ever come across. And that links us forward, as does the Ole Gunnar Solskjaer cheeky question, to your appreciation, because going back to 99 and Camp Nou, you've got a different view of the way in which Bayern Munich, again, funny how they come up. It's been a bad night for the Germans and the Bavarians so far. But you feel differently about how that game is portrayed, and unlucky Bayern Munich and Beckham's part in that match.
Yes, and I actually watched that game, would you believe, in a casino in Las Vegas. I was on holiday, and it was all over with the time zones, and I'm watching this, and I was watching with another Liverpool player, Dominic Matteo, and he was not as pumped up as I was to see Manchester United lose that game, and there was a complete contrast in emotions when the final whistle was made. He just got on with the rest of his night, and I was just felt like I wanted to go home on the next flight. But I watched that game, and again, that's one of the perfect ones. There was a narrative. Bayern Munich are winning 1-0. They hit the post, they hit the crossbar, and Man United scored 2 in the last minute. How have they won? The luckiest thing I've ever seen in my life. So I watched the game. Man United deserved to win that game. Bayern Munich played that game like they were playing an away game in Europe, where they get the early goal and we're getting our clean sheet. And Man United win at the best. But I thought the performance from David Beckham was outstanding. I thought he was the best player on the pitch by a long way. And again, something that's never been mentioned, because it's all about Solskjaer and Sheringham coming off the bench and winning the game. There was no Keane in that game. There was no Scholes. You have to remember, Beckham then went to central midfield. He's still only 23. He's still a young man. 23, 24, around there. And the responsibility he took in that game of taking the set pieces he normally did, but getting on the ball, demanding the ball, making passes, supporting the front players, still getting into wide positions and making crosses. And I actually think he's one of the most underrated players of our time. And people will say, don't be so stupid, people overblew Beckham. Well, they didn't overblow him. He got more attention because he looked like a pop star. He went out with a pop star. He had this glamorous lifestyle. But his actual ability and his work rate, I think, is undermined. Where to the point where people always talk about Paul Scholes being amazing. I don't hear no one say nothing about Beckham. Paul Scholes was amazing. But I very rarely hear anyone speak about David Beckham as a player once he finished. And watching that game again, and I didn't go in with any preconceived ideas about his performance as such. But when I watched the game, I got on the phone to Gary Neville straight away and I said, listen, I'm not trying to sell the book here by getting Beckham in it. I said, but I need to speak to David Beckham, because I've never heard anyone really speak about his performance, really, and how good it was. And yes, Man United weren't at their best. But if I'd urge anyone who disagrees with me to go back and watch the game again. And how many half chances United are getting. And we shouldn't forget as well, the goals they score, they're not great goals. The great chances I mean, it'd be difficult for Sheringham to miss. It'd be difficult for Solskjaer. I know he only sticks the boot out, but he's right in front of goal. So when we talk about Bayern Munich hitting the post and hitting the crossbar, that comes from an overhead kick, and it comes from Mehmet Scholl trying to chip Schmeichel from the edge of the box. So they would have been great goals. They weren't efforts where you should say he should have scored. It was a great chance. No, it was a great ability that almost got them a goal. Whereas the difference with United was they had big chances late in that game, really. And a metric we use now, maybe a bit too statistical for some people, but is expected goals that we look at now. And some people get it, some people don't, so that's fine. But Man United in that game, when the game was analysed in this day and age, if you like, with that tool, Man United was streets ahead of Bayern Munich within that game. So it was nice for something else to prove my point, because even when I say it to people just think, no, I can't understand it. So please watch the game.
The guy who, in our first chat for the podcast, you just had dinner with Alex Ferguson. It was hands across the divide, and it was interesting to hear the respect he had for you, not necessarily what you had for him, but I like that, I warmed to that, but you're quoting exactly what Alex Ferguson has always said about the game. In retrospect, once the glory dies down and the treble dies down, and he says to Steve McLaren, never mind extra time, we're winning this now, and blah, blah, blah. He has perpetually said, Bayern Munich were too conservative, they tried to shut up shop, we deserve to win, we played better. So your eyes are telling the same story as Fergie has retrospectively. And it's also, you point out that, there's a narrative that there was a late scramble, throwing of the dice, Beckham went right, the ball came in, and you don't even really buy into that narrative. And people should go and read this chapter. Sorry about the casino experience. I hope you bet on black, not red that night. I've got to ask you a personal one, Jamie, because Neil and I and Martin have published our own books. What was the match that didn't get in? There must have been 2 or 3.
There was one, and the reason... Basically, the book is... I wanted to start at my childhood, and I wanted to finish as recent as possible, so the book felt, from now as well. And I just didn't want it to be all old games, and I wanted it to be games that I'd either played in, which was the couple, or I'd watched as a pundit, or I'd watched as a fan. I didn't want to do England 1966 World Cup final, Brazil 70, maybe a game from Cruyff in the 70s. I wanted to sort of, games that I could remember. And the one team that isn't really in there is AC Milan from Sacchi Capello. And because the games we chose them for lots of different reasons. There's more Liverpool games than others because I think more Liverpool fans are possibly going to buy the book, and that's where I've got a greater idea of games, really. And almost, I wanted to cover a lot of styles of football in there, almost going from sort of that mid-80s football to gegenpressing now with Klopp. That's why Guardiola had to be in there, his team, and that football at Wembley. Obviously, Man United are in there, that 4-4-2, wingers, Ferguson taking chances. Even Mancini's game in there, Man City game, is these are all iconic games, but when I watched that game back, it brought me back to how that City team played. I almost forgot. And that really narrow, wide players, David Silva and Nasri, with 2 strikers, and almost 4-2-2-2 in some ways, with no great width in the team. But the one that we didn't get in that I wanted to get in was a Sacchi stroke Capello. That Milan team for me and the Guardiola Barcelona team are the 2 teams that for me, in my era or my recollection, have changed football. And it almost feels like there's so many links. Jurgen Klopp mentions Sacchi in the book. We don't speak to Guardiola, but you got Xavi in the book, and a lot of it's going back to sort of Cruyff and René Schmeichels, and there's just a great line really through the book, and it all feels like they connect. And possibly the one man we haven't got in there is Arrigo Sacchi, and that was the one. It was just, we were getting to the stage where I couldn't put one of his games against an English team, so I was thinking, how am I going to get the interviews? How am I going to speak to people? And I think the one that I always remember is the European Cup final in '89 at the Nou Camp, wasn't it, against Steaua Bucharest, and it was 4-0. I think Van Basten gets 2, Ruud Gullit gets 2, but that was the one that we were sort of running out of time, and it was like, we're maybe going to have to revisit that. So certainly AC Milan of the late 80s, early 90s.
Well, that's book 2. When this sells well, that's book 2. And you're talking about Saki, if I remember correctly, as a shoe salesman, came and snuck into Melwood to study how Liverpool were playing then. So if you're talking about a thread running straight through it, then it's that. And we're closing with 2, Jamie. We have to close with, this is not necessarily a one-word answer or a long answer, but Bet365 have asked us to ask you, if Liverpool played Barcelona on that night, the 4-0 night, 100 times, how often would they have won 4-0?
You know what? I think it'd be more than what you'd think, really. I know it's a freak. It'd be that Barcelona 4-0, but it wasn't even the Liverpool's best team. I think we have to remember that. There was no Salah, no Firmino. Yeah, and it was just... I just think, honestly, I just think the combination of Klopp, the crowd, and that team's almost in the middle. And I'm not trying to take credit away from the players because it was amazing, but I just think there's a concoction there of European nights, Anfield, and Jurgen Klopp's connection. And it's just what happens in the middle is the game. And it's just... I'm not saying it was meant to happen, but it was just... I just look at that, and I remember being at the side of the pitch when Barcelona finished the warm-up. And my only hope for that game was Barcelona think the game's won. So I was doing some TV work, and I was at the Anfield Road end, so where the Barcelona fans were, and I was watching them warm up. Okay, they're doing the warm up. You know, I'm not seeing nothing out the ordinary. And then the Liverpool players went in. There's a big roar, and then I seen Messi get the players in a huddle, and my heart sank. I thought, oh, they know how important it is, but it happened to them before.
Correct, it happened to them. They'd been pumped in Turin, they were pumped in Rome, having been 4-1 up and they lose 3-0. It was in there was a stone in their shoe already, you're right.
And I just felt, maybe this is not the night this is going to happen, really. And then, when we analysed the game and looked at it again, obviously what you want, an early goal, they get the early goal. But when you look at the goal, some of the things the Barcelona players did in that lead up to that goal, I couldn't believe it. Jordi Alba. I mean, I think Liverpool will have a corner. The corner gets cleared and Jordi Alba goes chasing the ball. It's only going to go back to the Liverpool goalkeeper. And then before you know it, Liverpool have recycled the ball. They've knocked a long ball to the left-back position. Jordi Alba does a bad header. The reason he does the poor header is because he's running back to position. So he's actually running backwards trying to head a ball instead of actually running onto it and heading it away. And just those little moments, Liverpool took, obviously, advantage of it. And to be honest, I think it was almost like an Istanbul moment where I always think that when the AC Milan players, they're probably thinking, something's happened that quickly. They haven't even had time to think. And I sometimes think about that with the Barcelona game where in that second half, things happened that quickly. It was almost like Barcelona were in a trance and could not believe what was happening. It just like, boom, before you know, the game's finished and they're out. And it's one of them. How's that happened? How has that happened? And yes, of course, more often than not, you're not going to beat a team of that quality 4-0. But I don't know. I just think there's something with Europe and Klopp's energy and personality. And I just think with Klopp's personality, I just think those type of events are more likely to happen than maybe with other managers. Because maybe there are other managers who have different strengths as managers, but his is actually almost making people believe something's going to happen and never... It's okay, we can all say, never give up, work hard. These are just words and, cliches, but when you actually believe it when someone says it, and I think that's the big thing. And I think Jurgen Klopp's team talk before that game was... again spoken about a lot, is that he said if this was another set of players in front of me, I don't think we could win. He said, but I think you can win. Now, of course, he'd have probably said that to us, another set of players in that position, but those players believed it when he said it. So straight away they feel 10 foot tall. It doesn't matter, it's Barcelona, it's Messi. And I just think there was not that it was always going to happen, of course it wasn't, but I just think there was just so many things aligning together, really, that made it more likely than what you'd expect.
Well, people need to know that Bantam Press is the greatest games book written by Jamie Carragher that what you've just explained there beautifully, hackles rising for me, because that's one of the most extraordinary pair of matches being at Camp Nou, Anfield, that I've seen in decades. There's a link there. We won't go into it now, but there's a link there in what you've talked about in terms of managing a situation or managing a lead. It links back to 1989 and what John Aldridge told you about the Arsenal game and preconceptions and what decisions do you make if you've got a perceived advantage. That's why the book punches well above its weight. I want to close, Jamie, because I promised you it'd be about an hour, with what I hope is a labour of love for you, because I know that one of the things you did is that you went and spoke to Xavi Hernandez in Qatar, or you got him on the phone about that Wembley game. And you and I were last, I think, together in Spain's training camp in Madrid Las Rosas, where you sat down and interviewed Xavi while Pepe Reina bombarded us with Italian swear words and burst in and took over the... But rather than describing Xavi as a player, why is it that he lights your candle? Because in my view, and I share it, but in my view, he's the player that probably most makes you excited about a brand of football that we maybe haven't seen in our islands so often. He's the guy who maybe converts you back into being the fan that you were at 9, travelling to Bavaria to watch Everton. We know what he does, but why isn't it Baresi for you, or Maldini for you, or why isn't it somebody who maybe shared more of the... I know you started in midfield, but just my question is, why? Why?
Well, Xavi was a player who I used to watch a lot of Spanish football when I was a younger player, and it wasn't when Barcelona were doing well. It was around the time of, Rafa's Valencia, Deportivo La Coruña. Was the manager Irueta?
Xavi Irueta, spot on.
I used to watch them teams and they were doing really well, and Valeron, Jalmina in there, Tristan, all these players, and there was obviously Barca and El Belder and Vicente in those teams, and actually John Carew, I think, at the top end of the pitch for Valencia. But I think but Barcelona weren't doing that well. I think it was at a time where Xavi was getting a little bit of criticism from Barcelona, maybe, the supporters. But so I used to watch them a lot, and I'd be like, I love this player. And I always remember him playing for, I think it was I don't know if it was England B or England under 21s, played Spain. And I remember, I think it may have been at West Brom's ground or Birmingham or something like that. And I just love the player. And I used to always speak to the Spanish lads about him. And I always find, and I found this going to England training, is everyone's a good player at international level. That's why you're there. But what defines, I feel, world-class players is players who stand out in that environment. So Stevie Gerrard would stand out at England training, Rio Ferdinand, John Terry, Paul Scholes. So there'll be 4 or 5. But the Spanish lads would always come back to me and I'd be saying, what's Xavi like in training? And he was a level above World Cup winners, And the thing, I mean, you mentioned Baresi before. I'd say my 2 favourites are Baresi and Xavi, because it's the brain, really. The thing that I love about Baresi is he's only 5'9". He's not 6'3" and dominating in the air and quicker and stronger than him. To get to the level he's had to think. And the same with Xavi, in that he's slow. He can't really... I mean, no, he's not slow. But he's not... You don't look at him and think athlete. But he's quick across the ground, the first sort of 5-10 yards. But it's the brain. I mean, it's... The thing I loved about Xavi, I would say, was nobody in the world who ever played against Xavi could stop him doing what he wanted to do.
Yeah.
You couldn't. So it was almost like, okay, no one could go and get the ball off him, so you couldn't stop Xavi running a game. And that was his job. So how good is that? That nobody can actually stop you doing what you want to do. It's almost okay, we have to accept that's going to happen. What can we do about another area of the pitch? So, and he'd be getting he'd be man of the match in the World Cup final. He'd be the best player in every tournament he played. He'd be man of the match in the Champions League finals. And it was almost like, I loved Iniesta, don't get me wrong, but it was almost like Xavi was in charge of the team. And this team was about, being on the ball and keeping possession, of course, and you can say Puel's a leader. But in terms of this team, is about keep making passes until the opener, and it was like, I'm in charge of this. And I always felt Baresi, that Milan team was maybe slightly different. It wasn't as possession-based. It was maybe the best defensive unit you've ever seen. The organisation of pushing up and being compact, catching people offside. It was almost like Baresi told everyone else what they had to do. And I always felt that was with Xavi. So that's why if I'm ever asked who are my favourite two people in football, yes, you can say Messi's the best player I've ever seen. That's normal. That's not original. But the ones that get my juices flowing are the ones who haven't, not so much got natural ability. Those two players got unbelievable ability, but they haven't got the full package. But the brain is just on another level to other footballers, and that's why I'm fascinated to see if he's in coaching now. I'm sure he'll end up being the Barcelona manager. But when you speak to him, he's so not confidence the wrong way, but he believes so much in his idea and the Barcelona idea and how it's going to work and what you have to do, that I just think it's going to be fascinating to see how he not just does at Barcelona, because I'm sure he'll be Barcelona coach, but I'm sure that'll only last 3 or 4 years. That's just the nature of Barcelona. But what he does and where he goes and what he gets involved in, because I just think the great minds in football, you always want them involved in the game, and there's certainly two. And I mean, I should mention, I wanted to speak about Saka. It'd be great to get Baresi, but one of the highlights for me is, I'm a footballer, I've played against Xavi in big games, but there's still footballers you look up to, even though you're at the top of your game, and Xavi is one of them. I'm still in awe of him. And the other one was Baresi, obviously never played against him. But I took my son to a Milan derby. So my birthday's the 28th of January, so it's normally FA Cup weekend in England, 4th round, always that weekend. So I wasn't doing a game for Sky, so the Milan derby's on. I'll take my son to the Milan derby. Got in touch with AC Milan, absolutely looked after me fabulously well, considering what had happened in 2005. But we get sat in almost executive seats, and we're sat next to Franco Baresi. And I'm like, I can't believe, I'm saying to my son, this is Franco Baresi. He's saying, who's that? Well, I said, you see that big banner behind the goal? And I'm not talking a banner, I'm talking the whole of the stand was covered with this thing for Franco Baresi, no other player. And I'm like, that's him. The fella you're sitting next to, that's him there. So that's how good he was. So that's why I love those type of players, really. The ones who have to, or need the brain to get them to the absolute elite.
Well, James was a lucky boy that day. Good luck to James. I think at Wigan, if I'm not wrong. Am I right?
Yes, he's at Wigan. He's doing okay.
Then that, as I anticipated it being, is just pure adrenaline, pure endorphins, a pure pleasure. You have a great privilege to be able to have played at your level, won things, and not just to continue in the game, but to be able to describe it and talk with the clarity and the intelligence, plus the passion that you do, Jamie. You've been given a gift. Thank you for sharing it with us. I'm going to say it again, and I think we've plugged a book in 106 or 107 interviews. I think we've plugged a book 3-4 times. So when I say that this is a really substantial, really interesting, thought-provoking read, it's The Truth, The Greatest Games by Jamie. Listen, absolutely phenomenal. People are going to love this listen. Thank you for being so generous with us and taking the time, Jamie. The big interview to Jamie Carragher, over and out.
Thanks, Graham.